Welcome back. South Africans have been forced to dig deep into their pockets to afford rising fuel and food costs, and they may have to dig even deeper with more fuel hikes expected. People know what this means for their personal budgets, but what does it mean for the economy at large? To explain this, Chief Economist at Econometrics, Dr. Azar Jamin, and Chief Commercial Officer at Lightstone, Linda Reed, joins us now in studio to discuss this. Thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it. Linda, let's start with you. What is your research showing in terms of how travel is being affected due to high fuel prices?
Well, Lightstone has partnered with a vehicle tracking firm, Tracker, and we have been analysing the millions of journeys that are taken every day by the vehicles covered by these tracking devices to pull out insights from them. Having tracked those vehicles for the past year, what we found is that over the course of the last year, people have been travelling a lot less than they used to a year ago. They've also been making far fewer trips to shopping centres than they were a year ago, and even fewer trips to service stations than the same period last year.
So Azar, we'll elaborate on the specific points of reference in that research as we go with this conversation, but let's talk about the overall impact that less travel has on the economy.
The most important impact, I suppose, is the fact that you have less petroleum being consumed than the growth, the growth in the consumption of petroleum is less than the overall growth of the economy, and it's a very sizable part of both the manufacturing sector and the overall economy, and therefore this does act as a bit of a drag on overall economic activity.
And Linda, let's look specifically at fleet vehicles and trucks that you mentioned in this research. What are you seeing there?
We were looking specifically at the commercial vehicles, particularly to try to see what the impact on the economy might be. What we're trying to develop here is an economic indicator, an economic predictor, where we can look at the behavior of these vehicles and try to see whether we can tell what's going to happen within the economy. And what we found was that within the commercial vehicles, delivery vans and trucks, we're seeing similarly a decline in the number of in the distance traveled and in the number of trips taken, which if you think about it, a decline in the number of trips taken by delivery vehicles can only mean a reduction in the goods being delivered, which indicates an impact on the economy.
And Azar, of course, let's talk about the impact on the economy in that regard specifically. I mean, the fact that we're not delivering as much goods to, stores speaks volumes.
That's a wonderful pun, but it actually does. But it's a chicken and egg thing. The economy is growing more slowly as a result of higher fuel prices, and therefore you need less. You don't need to actually deliver as many products as you did before. So the one thing feeds on the other, which in turn feeds on the first. It's a vicious circle.
Yeah. And then, Linda, of course, there is an indication that public transport was affected by strikes. We all know the knock-on effects of that. Tell us what you found in that regard.
Well, we separated this analysis out into looking at the taxis and buses. And what we saw was a lot of volatility in the distances traveled by buses, which coincided with the bus strikes, and that's what we took to be a cause of the volatility in the data that we saw.
Now, Azar, of course, when buses go on strike, bus drivers go on strike, anyone in the public transport sector, that of course means people are struggling to get to work, and that ultimately affects businesses.
Very much so. That is a distinct link, but it's not necessarily only and directly a consequence of higher fuel prices. It's a consequence of wage talks and that kind of thing.
Yeah. And let's look at, Linda, what you saw in the decline in retail activity. You mentioned this at the start of this interview. I mean, I saw also there's a decline of people going to shop.
That's exactly right. So overall what we saw was people are making 5% fewer trips to shopping centres and malls overall. The effect does vary across different malls. Some malls are unaffected, some malls are affected to a greater extent. But what we're seeing is that there is a bigger impact in how people are travelling on the weekend than there is during the week time. So where people are able to influence or to have choice over their travel, they are making that choice to travel less, and they are choosing to go to shopping centres less than they were a year ago.
And this will, of course, have a knock-on effect on retail figures coming out.
Very much. It's fascinating to notice how And people don't altogether appreciate the fact that fuel prices in March were no higher than they were in September last year. So you had virtually zero fuel inflation between September and March, and retail sales grew by between 4 and 5.5% in volume terms over that period. Suddenly, fuel prices rise by 25% odd since March, and retail sales growth has fallen to 1% or so.
So how high can we expect the fuel price to actually go? Because we know in the news already people are expecting another increase.
We're expecting another increase next week, but remember that the size of this increase is going to be less than it was in September last year. So the effect will not be as great as the fuel price increases that we have had over the last few months. In terms of predicting, it is so difficult at the moment. It depends on two critical factors. The first is the rand-dollar exchange rate, and it's already fallen a lot, so one is skeptical as to whether you're going to have further significant exchange rate declines. Secondly, oil prices have edged upwards quite a bit in the last month. Will they carry on increasing? There's far from conviction that that is the case. The Reserve Bank itself is predicting oil prices of only $70 a barrel over the next 2 years, and we're already at 76. So that means that they're implicitly expecting that oil prices could come back down again. So I would not take it as for granted that fuel prices will carry on rising.
You know, we keep saying that the fuel prices won't always carry on rising. Then we get hit with a smack bang 1 rand increase and we're all going into panic. And of course, this will again have a negative impact on so many sectors, especially in, people's everyday lives. What have you noticed with that? The way people travel, are they traveling smarter now, given that they're going to have to pay more for petrol?
I think that is one of the conclusions that can be drawn out of the research that we've done, where people can influence how they do things. They are choosing to do them more sensibly and more efficiently. One example is that, so while the petrol price is certainly one of the things that have influenced how many times people go to service stations, there's probably more to it than that. Another piece of research that we did highlighted that over half of people tend to go to service stations more than twice a week, which means that they're using it a lot more for the retail function than just for the service, for the fuel function as well. And that might be one of the things that explains why we've seen such a huge decline in service station visits, 10% from last year, because people are stopping in for their chips and a Coke a lot less than they would be. So that kind of behavior, I think that there is some subtle belt tightening going on with regard to their retail and their service station behavior that we can see in the data.
That's a good thing, because South African consumers are actually being smart when it comes to saving money, especially with high fuel prices in general. Because some research still shows that we like spending and buying on credit. So where's the balance here, and are we reaching that balance?
In a sense, I think South Africans have become much more responsible in their spending patterns in recent years compared with earlier years. We have not seen a huge surge in credit demand, and that means conversely that you're unlikely to see the kind of downturn, severe downturn in retail sales that you may have had during the global financial recession, or even in 2012 after the African bank unsecured credit boom.
Now, given all the doom and gloom we've spoken about, Azar, we're going to end with you, because we would like you to forecast and predict what we can expect in those growth numbers coming out next week.
The wildest card in that is agriculture. It's very difficult, the way it's measured, to know what has happened. In the first quarter, agricultural production, or GDP, fell by 24%. And that was the critical factor that caused us to have such a severe downturn in GDP growth. Conversely, one hopes that even if it comes out at 0% for the second quarter, that will provide a significant quarter-on-quarter statistical boost. But also, if we look at many of the other data that have been released on mining, manufacturing, production, on retail and wholesale sales, on building completions, the second quarter figure should be significantly better than the first, and I think very well nigh positive. But don't be misled. This is all statistics. Times are extremely tough. But foreign investors might suddenly take a slightly more positive view of South Africa because they see the headline figure saying, oh, they've returned to growth, and that's a good sign. But don't be fooled. Times are as tough as they, and we see it, I mean, every day some of the company results coming out showing how tough it is.
I'm glad we can end on a cautiously optimistic note. Thanks so much for your time. Appreciate both of you coming in. Economist Dr. Azar Jamin and Linda Reed from Lightstone.